He waded into the swamp without a second thought to save a tiger cub sinking into the mud. Holding the little one in his arms, he felt a wave of relief until something stirred behind him. When he turned around, everyone on the shore held their breath. What emerged would change the course of that moment and reveal something no one would ever forget. The air was thick with heat and tension, cicadas humming in a dissonant rhythm as Harold Reed moved deeper into the murky water. Locals knew better than to step into Cypress Hollow barefoot, let alone alone. But Harold had never been much for following rules, especially not when he saw that tiny creature flailing, eyes wide with panic, slowly vanishing beneath the sludge. He didn't hesitate. The tiger cub, as its orange fur slicked and darkened with muck, clung to his chest, trembling. For a moment, all Harold could feel was the fast beat of its heart against his own, and the odd warmth of having done something right. The onlookers, mostly tourists and a few nosy neighbors, watched in stunned silence. Then, just as Harold began to turn back toward the bank, something shifted behind him. It wasn't a splash, it wasn't even a ripple. It was the absence of all sound, like the swamp itself had taken a breath. Slowly, Harold turned, and that's when they saw it. A silhouette rising from the reeds, massive, deliberate, and disturbingly calm. Something no one had seen in decades, if they'd seen it at all. Whatever it was, it didn't belong to any ordinary wildlife report. And yet, Harold's eyes didn't show fear. They showed recognition. Harold Reed had always been the kind of man folks whispered about, but never really knew. In the town of Haversley, Louisiana, population just shy of 1-200, people clung to old stories like family heirlooms, and Harold had become one of those stories. He lived on the edge of the wetlands, in a cluttered old house filled with books, odd tools, and newspaper clippings that yellowed with time. Some said he used to be a wildlife biologist. Others claimed he'd been discharged from the military for something he refused to talk about. But the most common story, that Harold had once seen something in the swamp that changed him forever. He rarely came into town. When he did, it was for supplies, batteries, instant coffee, dog food, fishing wire. He never lingered, never smiled, and always paid in cash. Kids were half afraid of him, and the church ladies crossed themselves when his name came up. "Touched in the head," one old woman muttered after spotting him at the feed store. "But harmless," her friend replied. Still, there was something about Harold, a quiet gravity that made people look twice when he passed by. What no one expected on that particular summer morning was for Harold to become a local legend. The tiger cub had escaped from a small, traveling animal sanctuary. A fence had collapsed after a rainstorm the night before, and in the chaos, 2 cubs had wandered off. The handlers found one quickly. The second was missing. Tourists out on a flat-bottom boat spotted the little one, floundering in a thick patch of swamp grass, and started shouting. Nobody moved. Nobody knew what to do, until Harold stepped forward from the brush like he'd been waiting for this moment his whole life. He didn't ask questions. He didn't explain himself. He just walked into the mud, calf-deep, then thigh-deep, then waist-deep, until he reached the cub. When he emerged holding it against his chest, the onlookers broke into gasps and cheers. For a moment, Harold looked like something out of a movie, the loner turned hero. But the moment didn't last, because that's when the water behind him shifted, not in panic but in presence. A slow, deliberate swell, and Harold didn't run. He just turned around, eyes steady, like he already knew what was there. A woman on the boat let out a sharp gasp, not because of what she saw in the swamp, but because she recognized something else, the way Harold looked at the shape rising behind him. It wasn't fear, it was familiarity, the shape that rose behind. Harold wasn't fast. It didn't thrash or charge. It moved with the eerie calm of something that knew it didn't need to rush. A large ripple circled out from it, swallowing the earlier cheers and replacing them with an aching silence. The swamp, so often loud with insects and birds, had gone dead still. At first, people thought it might be another tiger, a bigger, maybe the mother. But this thing, it didn't move like a tiger. Its form was too tall, too sinuous. It rose, then paused, half submerged in algae-thick water, casting a long shadow over Harold and the cub. Then came the sound. Low, guttural, almost like a groan. Not a roar in the traditional sense, but something that felt older, more primal. It rolled across the water and settled in the chest of everyone watching, making their ribs feel too tight. The woman from the boat, the one who'd gasped earlier, and dived backed away, clutching the edge. "That's not an animal," she whispered. "That's something else." Harold didn't flinch. He didn't even turn to look at the people behind him. Instead, he adjusted the cub in his arms and spoke, softly, almost to himself. "You came back." Someone screamed, snapping the others out of their trance. A man fumbled for his phone, trying to film. Another shouted to get out of the water, but Harold just stood there, his boots sinking slowly into the muck. The shape dipped lower, vanishing beneath the surface again. Only a few ripples remained. Then, just before it disappeared, completely, something caught the light. 2 eyes, pale, luminous, watching. Harold began walking back toward the shore. No urgency, no panic, just a man doing what needed to be done. He handed the cub to one of the handlers without a word and kept walking, straight past the growing crowd toward the edge of the trees. He didn't look back. One of the men who'd been filming reviewed his footage, zooming in frame by frame. When he paused it on the eyes, those glowing, unblinking eyes, he muttered, "No way, that's not any species we know." And beside him, the woman whispered, "But Harold knew it." Long before tourists started posting pictures and animal rights groups came poking around Cypress Hollow, that patch of wilderness had its own kind of memory. Locals told stories, not the kind you'd find in guidebooks, but the kind whispered by grandmothers and drunk uncles. Strange lights, echoes with no source, creatures glimpsed just once, then never again. But most of those stories were dismissed as folklore. All except one, the legend of the Hollow Watcher. No one knew exactly what it was supposed to be. Some said a swamp spirit. Others believed it was an ancient predator, a relic that had survived from before the first settlers came. But Harold knew better. He wasn't guessing. He'd seen it before. Back at his home, a sagging 2-story cabin swallowed by moss and overgrowth, Harold stood at a window, staring into the trees. He hadn't spoken to anyone since the incident, hadn't answered calls, but in his mind, the memories were coming back with a kind of painful clarity. It was late summer 1979. He'd been just 16 and had wandered deep into the woods during a solo camping trip, too stubborn to tell his father where he was going. That night, something had stalked his camp. Not an animal, not a man, something aware. He never saw it clearly, only the shape, the breath, the eyes in the dark. It hadn't hurt him. It had watched him. And when he'd woken the next morning, his supplies were untouched, but a perfect circle had been carved into the earth around where he'd slept. Since then, Harold had returned to the woods year after year, drawn back by some invisible thread. He never told anyone, not even his mother, who died thinking he'd just been a lonely boy who liked the outdoors too much. Now, watching the forest from the same spot he had countless times, Harold whispered, "You're not a legend. You're a witness." And deep, in the swamp, something shifted. Not close but not far either. Taped to the inside of Harold's old journal, between sketches of eyes and strange footprints, was a torn photograph from 1981. A blurry image of something half submerged in water and scribbled across the bottom in faded ink, "It knows me." It started with a single photo, grainy, zoomed in, and just blurry enough to stir imagination. A pair of glowing eyes hovering above the swamp water, behind a man clutching a tiger cub. The image hit social media the same night the rescue happened, posted by a tourist named Claire Jensen with the caption, "This man just saved a tiger, but what's that behind him?" By morning, it had gone viral. News vans rolled into Haversley faster than anyone could remember. National outlets picked it up, calling it everything from swamp cryptid to real-life monster sighting. Wildlife experts debated over pixels on morning talk shows. Conspiracy theorists had a field day. The town, once sleepy and skeptical, buzzed like a stirred-up beehive. Harold, as usual, wasn't interested in the spotlight, but that didn't stop reporters from knocking on his door, setting up camp at the edge of his driveway, trying to bait him with money or promises of exposure. He ignored them all, but not everyone could. Sheriff Niles Caldwell, who'd known Harold since grade school, was suddenly under pressure. Calls came in from state officials, asking if the area needed to be secured. Animal control teams wanted access, and the townspeople, well, they were split. Half wanted Harold arrested for withholding information. The other half wanted him protected, even respected. For the first time in decades, people stopped seeing him as the weird old loner. He had become a symbol of something unknown, maybe even sacred. Meanwhile, Claire, the tourist who took the photo, returned to the swamp with a documentary crew. She claimed she wanted to understand the truth, but Harold knew better. She wanted the story, the fame. He watched them from the woods that afternoon, unnoticed. And when the cameras turned off and the crew wandered a bit too far into a thicket, Harold saw something, not the creature itself, but a new trail in the mud. Fresh, deliberate, almost guiding. One of the documentary crew members, separated from the group for just 5 minutes, came back pale and shaking. "Something followed me," he muttered, "but when I turned it was gone. No footsteps, no sound, just eyes." Inside Harold's cabin, the air felt heavier than usual. The curtains were drawn, the only light coming from the flickering flame of an old oil lamp. Stacks of journals lined the table, notes scribbled in cramped handwriting, sketches of animal anatomy, symbols, and sequences that seemed almost ritualistic. At the center sat Harold, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee, his eyes locked on an old photograph. It was a boy, younger Harold, standing beside his father, both of them posed in front of the swamp. His father's arm rested on his shoulder, but the boy's expression didn't match the moment. His face wasn't smiling. His eyes, even then, looked haunted. He remembered that day vividly. His father had dragged him into the swamp to make him tough, as he called it. It had been just the two of them, and it didn't go well. By dusk, his father had vanished, just stepped off into the trees after an argument and never returned. The official story was that he got lost. Search teams came. Dogs sniffed. Nothing. But Harold knew the truth, even if he never dared speak it aloud. His father had seen it too, the same eyes in the dark that watched now from the edge of the woods. Pale, luminous, sentient, not hunting, just waiting. That was the moment Harold changed. Not all at once, but piece by piece, year by year, he became quieter, obsessed with patterns in the wildlife, drawn to the same stretch of swamp where his father disappeared. He stopped talking about the future. Instead, he studied the past and what lived in its shadows. Now, as the world tried to label the creature behind him, cryptid, hoax, anomaly, Harold knew they were all wrong. It wasn't some mutant beast or undiscovered species. It was something older, wiser, something that chose when to be seen. He stood and walked to the mirror. For a long moment, he stared at his own reflection. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "You've been watching me my whole life, haven't you?" And in that silence, just before he turned away, something moved in the mirror. Not in the room, but in the glass itself. A flicker. Two eyes, far back in the darkness of the reflection, staring straight through him. The hum of generators and the crackle of radio chatter shattered the swamp's usual stillness. By midweek, the edge of Cypress Hollow looked like a base camp. Trucks with satellite dishes, bright tents, men and women in logoed vests, some government, others not, moved with a kind of urgency that didn't belong to the land. They said they were from the Department of Wildlife, but their questions dug deeper than ecology. They weren't asking about animals, they were asking about Harold. One agent, a sharp-jawed man in mirrored sunglasses, knocked on his door 3 times. Harold didn't answer. He didn't have to. The agent left behind a card with a seal he didn't recognize and a handwritten note. "You're not the only one who's seen it. The local sheriff tried to calm things down, but he was outnumbered and outclassed." The swamp, once ignored by the state, was now a hot zone. Drones buzzed overhead, scientists set traps, cameras, motion sensors, and at night, Harold could see the glow of their equipment blinking through the trees like mechanical fireflies. But the outsiders weren't the only ones drawn in. 2 men arrived in an unmarked SUV, claiming to be independent researchers. They spoke in soft tones, but their eyes scanned Harold's property like they were mapping it. One of them, a quiet woman with a snake tattoo curling around her wrist, asked a question that stopped Harold cold. "Has it ever spoken to you?" Harold shut the door in their faces. Later that night, he heard movement outside, subtle, intentional. He grabbed his flashlight and scanned the tree line. Nothing. But in the morning, he found footprints, human but barefoot, leading away, from his back porch toward the marsh. They weren't his. It was clear now. This wasn't about science or folklore anymore. Someone knew what lived out there. Maybe even more than Harold did. And they weren't here to study it. They were here to find it, control it, or kill it. And as he stood at the edge of the water, watching the fog rise like breath from the swamp, he realized the creature wasn't hiding out of fear. It was waiting to see who would break the balance first. Harold hadn't spoken in public for over a decade, but when the town council called an emergency meeting at the old community hall, something inside him shifted. Maybe it was the way the scientists kept treating the swamp like a puzzle to be solved. Maybe it was the unease he felt, like the balance was already tipping too far. Or maybe, for the first time in years, he realized the creature wasn't the only one who'd been watching. So he showed up. Worn boots, flannel shirt, eyes that hadn't truly rested in days. The room fell quiet when he walked in. Even the news crews lowered their cameras just for a beat. Sheriff Caldwell gave him a nod, the kind only childhood friends could give, and Harold took the floor. He didn't start with facts. He started with a story. He told them about the night his father vanished, about the circle in the dirt, about the eyes that watched from just beyond the firelight. He spoke of the years that followed, the dreams, the sightings, the carvings he found etched into tree trunks miles from any path. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if each word pulled something buried from deep inside him. Then he paused, looked around the room, and said, "You all think this thing is an animal, a creature, something to tag, capture, or run out of town. But it's not." He let that sit a moment. "It's older than any of us, smarter. It doesn't want to hurt anyone. It wants to be remembered. It wants to be left alone." Someone scoffed. A man from one of the research teams stood up and said, "You expect us to believe it's, what, intelligent?" Harold turned to him. "No," he said, "I expect you to believe that we're not the only ones who've evolved." The silence that followed was different this time. He hadn't convinced them all, not yet, but a crack had formed in their certainty. And some of them, especially the older ones, looked at him not like he was crazy, but like maybe they remembered something too. That night, back in his cabin, Harold found a new mark carved into a tree just outside his window. It wasn't one he'd made. It was small, precise, familiar. It was the same symbol from the circle where he'd once slept as a boy. Only now, it had been left for him. The morning air was thick with mist, and the swamp looked more like a painting than a place. Still, almost sacred. Harold stood at the edge of the water, clutching a small tin box he hadn't opened in decades. Inside were fragments of a life he'd tried to forget. His father's dog tag, a torn page from a field journal, and a tooth, long, curved, unnaturally smooth. He found it the day after his father vanished, lying in the middle of the circle. He'd never shown it to anyone, until now. The night before, 2 men in government-issued gear had knocked again, this time with a warrant. They planned to set traps, sweep the marsh, and begin tagging hostile wildlife. To them, the creature was a data point waiting to be pinned down. To Harold, it was the last untamed truth left in a world full of people desperate to own everything they didn't understand. He had a choice. He could stay silent, let them come, and risk turning the swamp into a battleground. Or he could lead the creature away, deeper, somewhere they wouldn't follow, somewhere no signal reached. He thought about the tiger cub, how it had trusted him, how it had looked into his eyes like it already knew him. And he thought about the creature, not just watching but responding, marking, communicating. He packed light, a flare gun, a compass, a journal. At dawn, he stepped into the water one last time. Each step deeper into the swamp felt like walking through memory. The sounds faded behind him. The humidity thickened. Then, without warning, it appeared, not in the way it had before, half hidden and distant, but clearly, massive, eyes glowing, chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. Harold didn't run. He knelt, pulled the tin box from his bag, and placed it gently on the mud. "You remember him, don't you?" he said quietly. "He didn't mean harm." "Neither do I." The creature stepped forward, its head tilted, expression unreadable. It looked at the box, then at Harold. And for a moment, just a moment, the space between man and myth collapsed. There was no fear, no threat. Then a sound pierced the quiet, a distant engine. The team was coming. The creature turned its head toward the noise. Its body tensed. Harold whispered, "Go, now, I'll keep them busy." And without a sound, it vanished into the mist, as if it had never been there at all. The marsh was quiet again. Days passed. The search teams combed the area, frustrated by dead ends and disappearing tracks. The traps they set remained untouched. Drones malfunctioned. Footage was inconclusive. It was as if the creature had never existed or had chosen to erase itself. But from their world, Harold never spoke to the media. He gave no interviews, signed no papers. After returning from the swamp that morning, soaked and silent, he made himself a cup of coffee and sat on his porch as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Claire Jensen's documentary was never finished. She admitted, off camera, that the footage felt wrong, like it told only half a story. Her last interview ended with a single sentence: "I think it let him go." Anadul town, rumors swirled. Some believed the government paid Harold off. Others claimed he led the creature to safety. A few insisted the whole thing was a hoax. But the sheriff knew better. He stopped by Harold's cabin one evening, brought him pie, and didn't ask a single question. They just sat there, watching fireflies blink over the dark water. Weeks later, when Harold's mailbox remained full and his cabin door untouched, neighbors grew concerned. Inside, everything was as he left it. Boots by the door, coffee on the table, his old journal open to a final page. In steady handwriting, it read, "Some truths aren't meant to be studied. They're meant to be respected, watched, protected. I didn't find it, it found me." His body was never found. But sometimes, just before dawn, those who live near the hollow say they see a figure at the edge of the water. A man, standing knee-deep, watching the trees. not moving, not speaking, and always, always theirs. Silence after the roar. If this story stirred something in you, don't leave without sharing your thoughts. Where are you watching from? And what part of Harold's journey moved you the most? We'd love for you to subscribe and join this growing circle of women who still believe in stories that matter, stories that leave a mark long after they end.